I'm not sure whether it's really likable. It's just, I think a lot of what this book does is it's creating pity for Zot, because you see Zot go through so many terrible things with her life kind of slipping away, and she's trying to claw back up to a more comfortable lifestyle like so many people in Egypt are. And so I think it's more of Ibrahim is trying to get us to pity Zot and what we've kind of established to be the Egyptian people to some degree, rather than necessarily like. It's just to more create an understanding of what's actually going on, and get people to empathize with the situation in Egypt.
I would rival that, because I don't think he's trying to get the reader to pity Zod, but rather to root for her, because especially earlier in the novel when the March of Demolition was happening, and Zod's like, no, I'm taking a stand and I'm gonna renovate our house. Like, you're supposed to be like, yeah, like, go Zod, like, who cares about Magweed? Or like, there's just like many situations where she doesn't let it, or sarcastic, like it doesn't get to her, like she cries, but then she bounces back the next day. You know, like we're supposed to think that, like, yeah, she's in a pitiful situation, but she's getting through it, she's persisting. So I think the point of Zot is to be in a pitiful situation, but for us to like root for her, not necessarily just pity her.
I think that illustrates one of the more likable qualities of Zot, and that's kind of her initiative and her determination. If you look at page 174 and 175, it shows that this is kind of unique to Zot, because Zot is with the heir apparent at the clinic, and she's trying to find the doctor, and she asks follow-up questions, which leaves the orderly astonished. So I think it's not common for people to actually be actively pursuing, trying to get things done. By taking this initiative, we do empathize with her more, and we can see that she's trying to make her life work, but it's still not working. And that kind of reveals it's not as much the people's fault as maybe like Egyptian society's fault, which kind of ties into some of the metaphors that we argued about earlier.
What page is that?
174 to 175, like the bottom and the top.
Yeah, I definitely feel like, going back to Max's question, we definitely, like personally, I like Zot. She's a cool person. And a lot of the things they'll show, Ibrahim will show something bad about Egypt, for example, the schooling and how poor that was. And then he'll show how Zot's sort of overcoming this. Like Zot is working late nights and working a lot just to get her son to be able to go to this Islamic school. Or, I mean, through a lot of things. For example, when she takes her son to the hospital, or when she's fighting through to try to get the March of Demolition and Reconstruction, she's sort of overcoming that, and we're like rooting for her, but we're also pitying for the situation she is. I think that makes us start to like Zot.
I personally have maybe what is controversial, but I really don't like Zot. I think she's weak and depressing, and I do pity her. And I think this also connects to what Vaughn was saying about pity, though, because it makes you like see how pathetic her life is and how awful like the struggles she goes through are. But I don't like her, like, at all. And I think Ibrahim kind of uses this, like, I mean, maybe some people like her, but I think Ibrahim uses this because he wants the tone of this book to be satirical. He doesn't want us to be, like, happy, really. He doesn't want to portray anything as happy in this book. So, I'm not being mean when I say this, I just really don't like Zot.
I actually agree with Ben on that. Well, I don't like Zot, but I don't really dislike her either. I think that Ibrahim wasn't really trying to make her a likable character. I mean, Zot's not really supposed to be like a feel-good book where like you get a great story and everything works out in the end. The whole purpose of the book was, even though it's a work of fiction, it was more like speaking out against the government. And through just the depiction of Zot's actions, like with her being oppressed, like even though she does stand up for herself sometimes, I mean, she really, like, that only happens a few times, and almost every time she kind of buckles under the pressure anyway. And just through, and I think Ibrahim was just trying to show how a lot of women in Egypt are kind of treated that way during this time, and how it was sort of the social and cultural norm to have women treated this way. And just as a consequence, I think some people just might view her as being strong or as being a likable character, even though I don't think this was Ibrahim's intention in the first place.
I don't think Zot's life is that pathetic. I mean, I think it's a pretty common thing, even in this country, even now, to, have a not great marriage. It's not awful. They've only fought once. I mean, they're kind of, it's an unhappy marriage. She has 3 kids. Something you really need to take into account is how the novel is presented, how like time is really nebulous. Like after the really interesting passage on 202, Abdel Majid is talking about how he has white hairs, and it's like, how much time has passed? Also, like, at one point Zot mentions her second daughter, and it's like she never talked about that. Suddenly she has 3 kids, like her husband's hair is graying. Time is passing really, really quickly. And this isn't Zot talking about her life. This is like little snippets. Like if you ask my mom, like today, if you like ask her how I was, she'd be like, oh, Mihal's like, I don't know, hopefully she'd be like, oh, Mihal's a nice girl or whatever. But like, if it was just like this continuous nebulous time thing, narration of my mother's life, she'd be thinking today like, oh gosh, she forgot to buy eggs for this experiment she's gonna do with the kids and I have to go buy them for her. Like, it's not this like, Zot isn't talking. She might say her life is pretty good, but since we're just seeing it as this like nebulous thing, we only see things that happen to her. It's not that bad. I think there's lots and lots and lots of people who, they don't really have friends at work. Their husbands don't talk to them that much. They have 3 kids, they're working. Like, it's not that pathetic of a life. I mean, it's not a great one, I'd say. So also, I want to pose 2 questions about this like time thing. So what's the purpose of having no real time? Like, it's just random splatters of things that happen without like narration. And my second question is, where do you think this book is going to end? Because it's going pretty quickly, and like, do you think it's going to end with Zot's death and being old and like her like seeing her kids be adults, or I don't know, I was just wondering about that, and I think it's an interesting thing to think about.
Going back to, I think Max brought it up originally about how there's not really much of a plot throughout the novel. It's just Ibrahim like picking out specific scenes in Zot's life, and I think that really, like Max said, really reinforces the fact that it's kind of supposed to be like a social and political commentary, because he could just describe like more of a narrative, a real story about Zot's life, but that's not his real purpose. His real purpose is kind of to shed light on all the corruption and just the problems that are deep-rooted within Egyptian society at the time in which Zot takes place, and I think that's why he chooses to just include these random snippets of Zot's life that are what really exemplify all these problems, and that's why and that is also reinforced by the fact that he interrupts each chapter with the newspaper clippings that relate, that all like each section of newspaper clippings that kind of backs up the problems that he's talking about that actually happened to Zot in her life. So I think that's the purpose of not really having a real time frame or a sense of continuous, I guess, flowing throughout the story. It's really broken up, and I think he's just trying to highlight individual problems that he wants people to be aware of, that he kind of wants to criticize, and he does that through he just picks out specific scenes, I guess, that occur, or things that happen to Zot that exemplify those problems.
I agree with Ariel. I think it's just like the no time, or not having a sense of time in this book kind of adds to the like theme of this like bad communication, not only in like the government but also just to the reader. His like style and tone of writing is like very long. He likes to use a lot of details that don't really matter, and it kind of confuses the reader. I think we can all agree that this book is like kind of like hard to and I think that the no time just kind of adds to that. You can't really like go on a timeline and follow the book.
I think part of it too, the lack of time also makes it more applicable to like more of Egyptian, like more of the centuries. If you think about it, like we know it starts somewhere around the 50s, 60s, I think, with like Nasser, and then we see a little bit of Sadat, and then I think we're into Mubarak now. But I feel like it almost makes it, this book, you could almost place it anywhere in that second half of the 20th century, and that makes it more relatable. And I feel like he's, in this case, Ibrahim's trying to see like there hasn't been a lot of progression made, like the state of Egypt hasn't necessarily progressed as much as it should have in the past couple of years, because you could stick this into any time frame there. Like if it had gotten better, this book would have been confined to a couple, like maybe a decade of like this terrible corruption, but because it isn't, and we don't really know, I feel like it just portrays it like they don't know when it's going to stop, or when it's going to change, or when it's going to end. It's kind of a sense of hopelessness, actually.
I have a question about Ibrahim's credibility. If he is, like what we're saying, is using Zod as a social commentary, and he's taking Zod's entire life and then only taking this, like, if he's only taking the parts of it that are negative, I guess, and just only showing the problems in her life, and he's not, like, giving us a whole, like, large perspective of her entire life, does that make it Zod a credible portrayal of Egyptian society if it's not, like, showing the ups and downs in Zod's life, but only shedding light on the problems?
Well, I definitely think that Zod, like the book as a whole, is definitely biased against the Egyptian government. I mean, Ibrahim, he used to be a political activist, and then he got jailed for his beliefs and speaking out against the government. So we can obviously tell that he doesn't really like the government, and we can see through the book how he's always criticizing the government. A lot of the actions that happen, or a lot of the things that happen in Zod, are like a consequence of the government's incompetence, and also in the newspaper clippings. You see how the government like doesn't really know what's going on, they're always telling lies, and it's really undermining the authority of the government. So I think the book is definitely biased, because you can't really have you can't really have Ibrahim as like a credible person because of his predispositions and his dislike of the government.
I think the book being biased does not necessarily affect his credibility, because his main point throughout the book is trying to show the negative aspects of Egyptian society. So having snippets of Saad's timeline does in fact help us see all this negative progression that is seen throughout. So I think taking out little parts of Saad's life adds to his credibility, since he's able to create such a good setting to show everyone as to how bad the Egyptian politics are.
Well, I actually think that Ibrahim just taking certain parts of Zod's life further erodes his credibility, because if he wanted to show how Egypt was such a bad place during this time, he would have just talked about like every event as a whole. But since he's just kind of cherry picking certain events that were bad, he's really only emphasizing the bad parts of the Egyptian culture and completely neglecting the good parts, just for the sole purpose of undermining the government.
Well, I think we need to remember that that is a work of fiction, so that he created the characters, so he's not cherry picking because he created her. And we know, like we talked about, how Ibrahim has the purpose of illuminating the conflict and like corruption in Egyptian society. So that's his purpose of the book. So he's obviously not going to be like, oh, Zod had such a happy life. He's going to make a story that like directly shows what's happening in Egypt. So I think like him like having the time periods when Zod's life is hard and difficult, I don't think that makes him less credible, because again, like he made Zod and her life like for a purpose, and he's not gonna and so obviously like he's gonna have a purpose, and he's gonna like, I don't know, he like made Zod, so he's not gonna have her life go happy when that's the opposite of what he wants to prove.
In response to this whole idea of time, go back to page 1 of the book. I'm just gonna read the first two sentences. We could begin Zod's story from its natural beginning. That is, from the moment she slid into our world, bespattered with blood, and the shock, the first of many she would endure, that followed as she was